Imagine a sudden, loud crash on a busy street. For a brief moment, the world collapses into a single point of focus. This isn't a failure of your senses, it's a feature of your brain's survival mechanism. During high-stress events, your brain's prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function, experiences a decrease in blood flow. This triggers a state of attentional narrowing, sometimes called a cognitive tunnel. Your brain makes a crucial, instantaneous decision about what information is vital for survival and what is simply noise. The color of a nearby car, the song playing from a storefront, the face of a person just a few feet away, all of it can become irrelevant data, filtered out before it ever has a chance to become a memory. You are not recording the event. You are experiencing a highly edited version curated by your primal instincts. This filtering becomes intensely specific when a threat is introduced. The weapon focus effect is a stark example of this. In countless studies, when a weapon is present, a witness's memory for the perpetrator's face, clothing, and other details plummets. The brain allocates its limited cognitive resources to the object posing the greatest danger. It's an ancient evolutionary response. You don't need to remember the color of the tiger's eyes, only the location of its teeth. The phenomenon is so powerful that even a non-threatening but unusual object, like a person paying for groceries with a bright yellow banana instead of cash, can produce the same memory-draining effect. The object's novelty or threat level hijacks your attention, essentially starving other details of the neural processing required to form a lasting memory. The rest of the scene becomes a blurry, unreliable periphery. The mechanism behind this isn't just psychological, it's deeply chemical. A surge of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline fundamentally changes how your brain encodes information. The amygdala, your brain's fear center, goes into overdrive. It essentially screams, "This is important," and tags the central elements of the experience for high-priority storage. However, this same chemical cocktail impairs the functioning of the hippocampus, the region responsible for contextualizing memories and placing them in a coherent narrative. The result is a bizarre paradox. You get a memory that is intensely vivid but also profoundly fragmented. You might remember the flash of steel with perfect clarity for the rest of your life, but you won't be able to recall if the person holding it was wearing a hat. The emotion sears the what into your mind while simultaneously eroding the who, where, and when that surrounds it. It's like a photograph with a perfectly exposed subject but a completely black background. But the memory's journey of distortion has only just begun. A memory is not a stone tablet. It's a delicate web, and it's most vulnerable in the hours and days after it's formed. This is where post-event information begins to contaminate the original recording. Consider the work of Elizabeth Loftus, who showed that simply changing one word in a question could alter memory. People who were asked how fast cars were going when they smashed into each other reported higher speeds and even remembered seeing broken glass that wasn't there, compared to those asked about cars that hit each other. Every conversation with another witness, every news report you see, every question an investigator asks has the potential to act as a patch, writing new code into the original memory file. Two witnesses discussing the event might inadvertently merge their memories, creating a new shared version that neither of them actually experienced alone. The memory of the tall suspect from one witness can easily become your own. Your brain isn't trying to deceive you. It's trying to build a more complete, coherent story. This leads to the most unsettling part. Memory is never a process of simple retrieval. It is always an act of reconstruction. When you recall an event, you aren't playing a video file. You are accessing scattered fragments of the original experience. The sound, the feeling of fear, a single visual snapshot, and your brain rebuilds the event around them. To fill the gaps, it uses schemas, which are mental frameworks of how the world is supposed to work. If the event was a robbery, your brain might pull from its robbery schema and add details you never saw, like a getaway car waiting outside, or the robber shouting, "Give me the money," because that's what happens in robberies. These additions aren't lies. They are unconscious inferences, logical gap fillers that make the memory feel more complete and sensible. The act of remembering, then, changes the memory itself. Each time you recall the story, you are re-editing it, strengthening the connections for some details while overriding others. The memory you have a year later is a patchwork quilt of original sensation and subsequent reconstruction. This is why an eyewitness can be both 100% confident and 100% wrong. Confidence is not a measure of memory accuracy. It is an emotion, a feeling about the memory you've just reconstructed. This feeling can be dangerously inflated by factors that have nothing to do with the original event. For example, receiving positive feedback from an investigator, like, "Good, that's who we thought it was," can dramatically increase a witness's confidence in their incorrect identification. The brain commits a source monitoring error, where it remembers the detail but forgets the source. It forgets that the detail about the suspect's scar came from a news report, and instead misattributes it to the original perception of the event. The clarity and detail of the reconstructed memory feel real, and that feeling of realness is what we label as confidence. Research has repeatedly shown a startlingly low correlation between witness confidence and accuracy. Yet to a jury, a confident witness is an incredibly persuasive one. So when two people witness the same crime, they don't just remember different details. They walk away with fundamentally different events stored in their minds. One person's cognitive tunnel may have focused on the assailant's angry voice, while another's was locked onto the escape route. Later, one may have seen a news report that contaminated their memory of the car's color, while the other integrated a detail overheard in a conversation. Neither is lying. Both are reporting with utter sincerity the story their brain has constructed for them. It reveals that our past is not a fixed landscape we can revisit. It's a living narrative, constantly being edited, reinterpreted, and rebuilt by the strange and fallible machinery inside our own heads. Monotony has grown fast. Nearly 2,700 people have watched in the last few weeks, yet less than 0.03% are subscribed. It would mean a lot if you joined by hitting subscribe. And again, thanks for watching.